A night that seemed peaceful transformed into the beginning of a terrifying nightmare. A husband, blinded by his mistress, didn't hesitate to cruelly slap his pregnant wife. Her muffled sobs and the pain in her eyes tore through the silence, but he had no idea that a single blow would be the start of his complete ruin. The young woman's father, a powerful CEO, was quietly preparing a revenge that no one could have imagined. In the blink of an eye, the man's honor, his career, and even his freedom would crumble. From an arrogant figure who believed he had the world in his hands, he would become a hollow shell of a man, watched with fury and contempt by his family and all of society. In the heart of Charleston, a spring festival was in full bloom. Sarah Williams, her pregnancy evident, walked slowly through the crowd before settling at a table with her parents at an outdoor cafe. Her eyes searched for her husband, Mark Jensen, convinced that this family gathering would be a chance for her to feel supported. Her father, Mr. Richard Williams, a man of quiet power and serious demeanor, observed everything with the composure of someone who has navigated years of difficult business decisions. Her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Williams, stayed close to her daughter, her tender touch barely concealing her deep concern. When Mark arrived, he came with his usual polished demeanor. Impeccable suit, phone in hand, he offered quick hellos and slumped into his chair as if the meeting were a tiresome chore. Sarah looked at him with hope, searching for a warm smile, but she was met with only curt phrases and a cold distance. The initial conversation revolved around the baby on the way. Sarah tried to fill everyone with her joy, talking about names, the bassinet she imagined for the nursery, and strolls along the Ashley River. Her parents listened with love, proud to see her so dedicated to motherhood. Mark answered in monosyllables, his eyes glued to his phone which vibrated incessantly. Each time he looked down, Sarah felt a pang in her heart. His distraction wasn't new, but that private smile on his face as he read a message was a strange and unsettling new development, as if a dark secret was beginning to reveal itself. Mr. Williams tried to keep the conversation going, asking Mark about his work. His son-in-law spoke of meetings, contracts, and numbers that seemed to hold more life for him than his own family. Sarah smiled with forced patience, convincing herself that her husband had always been this way, absorbed by business. But a bitter doubt was growing inside her. Mrs. Williams watched her daughter carefully, noticing how Sarah feigned calm while hiding a silent pain. The contrast was stark. A pregnant woman dreaming of a united family, and a man who seemed to have his mind elsewhere entirely. Sarah looked for another chance to connect with her husband. She suggested a walk at sunset, together on the historic bridge, like the young couples who filled the city with laughter. Mark nodded without conviction, still absorbed in his screen. She felt the silence becoming unbearable. Then she remembered her parents were there and decided to save her questions for later. She didn't want to argue in the middle of the square or ruin the afternoon. Yet her unease clung to her like a burr lodged deep in her chest. The buzz of the crowd continued, but Sarah barely heard it. What truly occupied her mind was Mark's behavior. He spoke animatedly with an acquaintance who had stopped to say hello, and in that moment, for the first time all day, he flashed a wide, genuine smile. Sarah finally understood that she was no longer the cause of his smiles. She felt a hollowness she had never experienced before, as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to sand. Mrs. Williams leaned in and asked softly if she was all right. Sarah replied with a nod, trying to hide the tears that were threatening to spill. As the afternoon wore on, the family finished their simple meal. Mr. Williams paid the check with his usual quiet courtesy, leaving a modest tip. Sarah gathered her things slowly, as if she wanted to postpone the moment she would have to return to the solitude of her home with Mark. They walked together to the square's exit, and on that walk, Sarah looked once more at her husband's face. He gave her a fleeting glance and then lost himself in his phone screen again. It was all the confirmation she needed for the suspicion that had been growing inside her. The young mother-to-be pressed her lips together to hold back the pain. Her heart, which had been beating with hope, began to fill with questions. She knew she couldn't ignore the signs of his distance and disinterest any longer. She knew that sooner or later she would have to face the truth. But at that moment, she chose to stay silent, clinging to the illusion that perhaps it was all a misunderstanding. She held on to that possibility like a person clinging to a life raft in a dark and stormy sea. Sarah's parents said their goodbyes with a hug, wishing her peace and reminding her that she could always count on them. Sarah smiled gratefully, feeling the warmth of their support. However, as soon as she was alone with Mark, her smile disappeared. The drive home was spent in a silence thick with unspoken thoughts, with the certainty that the calm they were feigning would soon shatter. "Who's texting you at this hour? And why are you smiling like that?" Mark Jensen left his downtown office late in the afternoon with a weariness that wasn't physical, but mental. He walked the streets of Charleston with quick steps, as if trying to escape something that was bothering him. Sarah had spoken to him at lunch about baby names and family outings, but her words had sounded distant to him, like a faint echo. The only thing he could truly hear was the memory of the messages on his phone, the spark that made him feel admired. That memory guided him without a second thought to a modern bar near the university, a place he had stumbled into a few weeks earlier where he had found an unexpected presence. The place was full of students and professors winding down their day. There was laughter, quick conversations, and a constant buzz that enveloped the entire space. Mark made his way to the bar. There was Jessica Adams, a young bartender who had served him the first time and who ever since greeted him as if she saved a spot for him. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her smile seemed designed to disarm all defenses. When she saw him come in, her eyes lit up with a special sparkle. "Hey, Mark," she said, in a tone that blended professionalism with a knowing intimacy. He responded with a slight nod, but inside he felt a jolt of energy. He ordered a glass of wine, and Jessica served it with practiced grace. The conversation flowed effortlessly. She asked him about his day, and Mark, who could barely find words for Sarah, began to talk about contracts, ongoing deals, and the importance of his decisions at the company. Jessica listened with exaggerated attention, nodding at every phrase and adding small comments that made him feel more important. "A man like you deserves to be recognized," she said at one point as she cleared glasses from the bar. Mark felt how deeply those words resonated. Sarah at home would be preparing dinner or folding baby clothes. That thought crossed his mind fleetingly, but he pushed it away quickly. Here, in front of Jessica, he didn't feel like an absent husband or a distracted father-to-be. He felt like a powerful man, one whom someone looked at with genuine admiration. She spoke of her own dreams, of how she wanted to move on from the bar and find a different path. She did so in a soft, almost confidential voice, and in those words, Mark felt there was a reflection of himself, a shared quest. The bartender leaned in a little closer and lowered her voice. "Sometimes life at home can get a little too routine, can't it?" Mark felt a knot in his stomach. It was as if she had read his thoughts. He didn't answer immediately, but Jessica's smile encouraged him to let go. He mentioned that lately he had felt trapped, that the pressure was enormous, that he needed to breathe. She looked at him intently and said with confidence, "A man like you can't be chained to a boring life." That single sentence hit him harder than any argument at home. The glass emptied and he ordered another. Time seemed to speed up. Jessica moved between customers, but she always came back to him with a question, a compliment, a look. Mark felt that each of her gestures was a lifeline in a sea of monotony. When she handed him the check, she discreetly slid a piece of paper with her number written on it. He took it without much thought and put it in his pocket like a hidden secret. In that instant, he knew he didn't want to dismiss that possibility, that something in his life was about to change. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah ate dinner alone. She had prepared a simple meal with the hope of sharing it, but the empty seat across from her confirmed what she already suspected. Mark preferred to be somewhere else. She didn't know where, she didn't know with whom. But the coldness of his absence was a silent blow. She placed a hand on her belly and promised silently that she would take care of their child with all her strength, even if the father seemed to be moving farther and farther away. Mark left the bar with a confident stride, with the feeling that he had reclaimed something he thought he had lost. The city was still vibrant, with students celebrating and tourists wandering the lit-up streets. He kept Jessica's number like a talisman. He didn't think about the consequences, or about Sarah's face waiting for him, or the weight of the promises he had made. He only thought about the thrill of the moment, that spark that made him feel desired. He walked through the city as if the future belonged to him, convinced that he had just opened a door to new possibilities. He couldn't have imagined that behind that very same door lay the seed of a conflict that would end up bringing down everything he had built. In his pocket, the paper burned like an impossible-to-ignore temptation. Mark squeezed it with his fingers and knew, without wanting to admit it out loud, that he would never erase it. As Charleston celebrated the arrival of spring with fireworks, a tension hung in the air in Sarah Williams and Mark Jensen's apartment. Sarah had prepared a simple dinner, convinced that sharing a meal was a way to keep alive the bond she felt was growing more and more fragile. She had carefully set the table and tried to sound cheerful, talking about the baby and doctor visits. Her words sought an echo in her husband, but each phrase bounced off the wall of his indifference. Mark, sitting across from her, responded with monosyllables as he glanced at his phone, which vibrated repeatedly on the table. The smile that each notification brought to his face was an invisible knife to Sarah. She tried to turn the conversation to the future. She mentioned that she had seen a beautiful light-colored wooden bassinet in a store downtown, perfect for the baby's room. She imagined the first nights, the first cries, and spoke with tenderness. Mark barely looked up. "Yeah? Sure?" he responded. Sarah swallowed hard and tried not to lose her composure. Rage and sadness fought inside her, but the instinct to protect her child pushed her not to get too upset. Jessica's voice, which he had heard just hours earlier at the bar, echoed in his head like forbidden music that made him forget where he was. Sarah observed his distant gestures, the way his fingers stroked the screen, as if that was where his real life was. The silence became unbearable. So, with a courage born of desperation, she asked directly, "Mark, is there another woman?" The question dropped like a clap of thunder into the middle of the room. For a moment, he froze, as if he hadn't expected the confrontation. Then he reacted with sudden harshness, putting down his silverware and raising his voice. "Don't make things up, Sarah. You're being obsessive," he said coldly. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't back down. "It's not an obsession," she replied. "You've pulled away. You don't even look at me anymore. You smile at that phone like you never smile at me." Mark scoffed in impatience and got up from the chair. He paced the room with short, agitated steps. Sarah followed him with her eyes, trembling but firm in her need to hear the truth. Her heart hammered in her chest. The image of the city streets lit up by the festival came through the window, but in their home there was no celebration. Mark turned abruptly and said with contained anger, "I'm sick of your complaints. You don't understand anything." She, her voice breaking, insisted, "I'm your wife. I'm carrying your child. We deserve your honesty. What is going on?" The tension reached an unbearable point. The distant sound of fireworks accompanied the argument like a cruel echo. Sarah took a step toward him, hoping for a gesture of closeness, a minimal sign that he still cared. But the only thing she received was a phrase that shattered her soul. "Don't talk to me about the future. I don't even know if I love you anymore," Mark said with brutality. The words hung in the air like a blow she couldn't deflect. Sarah stood paralyzed, her face contorted with pain and tears streaming down. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The man with whom she had dreamed of a life together, the father of her child, had just ripped all her hope away with one merciless phrase. Outside, the fireworks painted the sky with colors, but for her, the night had turned dark and silent. Mark grabbed his phone, put it in his pocket, and walked away into the bedroom without looking back. Sarah remained standing for a few seconds, then collapsed into the chair, giving in to sobs she couldn't contain. She put her hands on her belly, as if in that gesture she could shield her child from the sadness that was tearing her apart. The dinner remained untouched, the plates cold on the table, silent witnesses to a love that was now in pieces. The woman thought of her parents, of the peace she had felt that same afternoon while sharing a moment with them in the square. She remembered her mother's attentive gaze and her father's thoughtful silence. Maybe soon she would have to turn to them, because the battle she was facing seemed too hard to bear alone. She closed her eyes for an instant and wished with all her might that Mark would reconsider, that those words had been born of rage and not of truth, but the echo remained, hammering in her mind, "I don't even know if I love you anymore." The night wore on. The city's buzz seemed to celebrate something that didn't exist in her heart. Sarah stayed alone at the table, tears sliding down her cheeks, while the glow of the fireworks lit up the windows in cruel contrast to the darkness of her soul. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the small cafe where Sarah Williams had met her mother. It was a fresh and bright morning in Charleston, but for her, the day felt faded. She had cried in silence all night, with Mark's cruel words still echoing in her head. "I don't even know if I love you anymore." She had repeated those phrases in her mind like a whip, while hugging her belly to find strength in the life growing inside her. Mrs. Williams greeted her with a warm smile and a long embrace. She looked at her carefully, as only a mother can, and immediately knew something was wrong. Sarah tried to hide it with short phrases, saying she was tired and that the pregnancy was making her sensitive. Her mother didn't press, preferring to listen and provide comfort. As she slowly stirred the hot chocolate in her cup, Eleanor shared anecdotes from when Sarah was a child, trying to get her to smile. Sarah listened, grateful for the tenderness, but a veil of sadness covered her eyes, impossible to hide. Her mother caressed her hand gently and told her that the family would always be by her side, no matter what. Sarah looked down and nodded in silence. She wanted to tell her what happened, to confess that Mark was hurting her with his coldness and his absences, but she held back. She didn't want to worry her parents just yet. In another part of the city, just a few streets away, Mark was being carried away by the seduction of Jessica Adams. He had spent the night with the memory of her lips and that one phrase that haunted him. "A man like you can't be chained." He met her at a bar where the music was soft and the atmosphere relaxed. Jessica greeted him with a smile that promised complicity. She served him a glass of wine and asked him in a suggestive voice if he had been thinking about her. Mark, emboldened, replied that he had, that he couldn't get her out of his mind. She celebrated his answer with a light laugh that wrapped around him like a spell. While Sarah tried to keep her composure in front of her mother, Mark sank deeper into the illusion Jessica offered. She asked about the company, about his ambitions, about what he dreamed of beyond his family life. Mark spoke with enthusiasm, bragging about contracts, ongoing deals, and a promising future. Jessica listened as if every word were a treasure. For him, that attention was a balm that made him feel powerful. He didn't think about Sarah or the child on the way. He only thought about the sparkle in those young eyes that looked at him with desire. In the cafe, Eleanor insisted that Sarah should rest more, that she couldn't carry everything on her own. Sarah smiled slightly and said she was fine, but her voice sounded weak. Inside, she fought against the idea of admitting the truth. She wondered how long she could stay silent. She remembered Mark's face lit up by his phone, the smiles that weren't for her, and a deep pain shot through her chest. The pregnancy made her more vulnerable, but at the same time, it gave her an unexpected strength. For her child, she had to endure, even if the nights were getting harder. Jessica used every minute to sow seeds of doubt in Mark's mind. She told him that a man like him deserved a different life, one full of passion and adventure, not a boring routine. He listened to her, fascinated. Each word was a confirmation of what he wanted to hear. When she brushed his hand over the counter, he felt there was no turning back. He saved her number in his phone and promised her they would see each other again. Jessica smiled with satisfaction, knowing she had him right where she wanted him. Sarah finished her coffee and said goodbye to her mother with a long hug. She hadn't dared to confess anything yet, but in her heart she knew that soon she wouldn't be able to stay silent anymore. Her mother walked her to the street, placed a scarf around her neck, and reminded her she would always be there. Sarah was grateful for the gesture, fighting back tears. She walked slowly toward her home, with the determination to face the storm she knew was inevitable. Mark, for his part, left the bar with a glowing face. He felt he had found a new lease on life, a thrill that gave him back his vitality. He couldn't have imagined the abyss he was opening with every step. He walked on, convinced that he was in control of the situation, while in his pocket, Jessica's contact burned like a dangerous secret. Eleanor caressed Sarah's hand and whispered sweetly that her family would always be there for her. Sarah squeezed the cup between her hands, debating whether to confess the truth. Spring filled the streets of Charleston with flowers and songs, but in Sarah Williams and Mark Jensen's apartment, the air was thick with tension. It was Sunday afternoon, and the city was alive with the sound of street guitars and children's laughter, while in their home, a heavy silence reigned. Sarah had spent hours thinking about what she was going to say. She had decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her heart was pounding, but also with conviction. She was tired of watching Mark take refuge in his phone and of his words becoming cold responses. When he walked into the living room, she sat up straight and looked him in the eye. Mark had spent the day distant, locked in his own thoughts. He took off his jacket with a rough motion and threw himself onto the couch as if everything around him bothered him. Sarah watched him with a mix of fear and determination. She had carefully prepared the conversation in her mind, knowing it could trigger a fight. The moment came when she saw him sliding his finger across his phone screen again, smiling with that expression that no longer belonged to her. With a firm voice, Sarah broke the silence. "Mark, we need to talk." He looked up, annoyed, as if she had interrupted something more important. "About what?" he asked, uninterested. She swallowed hard and said the words that had been building for days. "Is there another woman?" The question shook him. For an instant he was silent. But then he reacted with fury. He suddenly stood up and accused her of imagining things, of being jealous for no reason. Sarah didn't back down. "I'm pregnant with your child. I deserve the truth," she said, her voice broken but firm. Mark started pacing the room, mumbling phrases filled with anger. "You have no proof. You're making things up. You always exaggerate." Sarah followed him with her eyes, feeling that each word was a dagger. It wasn't just about proof, it was about the coldness that had transformed him, the distance he could no longer hide. "Don't be a coward," she added. "You're not the same." You don't look at me. You smile at that phone like you never smile at me." The accusation stopped him for a few seconds, but instead of answering truthfully, he exploded with more verbal violence. The atmosphere became suffocating. Sarah stood up and faced him with tears in her eyes. "Why are you doing this to me? Why do you choose lies instead of looking at what we have here?" She touched her belly with both hands, reminding him that she wasn't alone, that inside her was a life that was also his. Mark looked at her with a mix of rage and confusion. He hit the table with his fist, and the sound echoed throughout the apartment. "I can't stand your scenes!" he yelled. At that moment, his phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up and showed a name. Sarah saw it clearly. Jessica. The silence became even heavier. Mark immediately went to grab the phone, but it was too late. Sarah had read enough. Her face went pale, and although tears streamed down her cheeks, her eyes conveyed a dignity he hadn't expected. "Now I understand," she murmured bitterly. Mark tried to justify himself. He mumbled excuses about business, about a simple friendship. Sarah wasn't listening. She felt that the wound was too deep. The certainty had fallen on her like a stone. The man who was supposed to protect her and be with her at the most fragile moment of her life was giving his smiles to someone else. She couldn't forgive him at that moment, and she couldn't stay silent either. The argument became even more bitter, with accusations and laments thrown back and forth. The climax came when Mark, beside himself, yelled that he was tired of everything, that the routine was suffocating him. Sarah was trembling, but she didn't move. She stood straight, her gaze fixed on him, with the strength of a mother defending her child even before it was born. Her tears fell non-stop, but her voice came out clear. "You will not destroy me, Mark. I won't let you." The afternoon in the city continued. The sounds of the festival reached the window, but inside that apartment, everything had been broken. Sarah felt that a chapter of her life was ending, though she didn't yet know what steps to take. She understood that the truth could no longer be hidden. The festival music resonated in the streets of Charleston with drums and voices, but in Sarah Williams and Mark Jensen's apartment, the atmosphere was oppressive. The bright lights came through the window and cast shadows on the wall, a cruel contrast to the intensifying argument inside. Sarah had gathered her strength after discovering Jessica's messages and stood her ground in front of her husband. In a trembling but determined voice, she repeated the question she could no longer avoid. "Mark, tell me the truth. What do those messages mean? Who is Jessica to you?" The initial silence was more painful than any answer. Mark paced back and forth, holding his phone as if it were a weapon he had to protect. His face was contorted with rage. "You have no right to go through my things," he yelled in a hoarse voice. Sarah took a step back but didn't look away. "I am your wife, and I am carrying your child. I have the right to know why you smile with another woman while you deny me a single word of affection." Her tears mixed with the strength of her voice, creating a contrast between vulnerability and courage. He approached with heavy steps and looked at her with fury. "You're paranoid. You're suffocating me." Mark's hand suddenly flew up, and before Sarah could react, the slap exploded against her cheek with a dry crack. She lost her balance and fell to the floor, instinctively putting her hands over her belly to protect the baby. The echo of the blow hung in the air for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Sarah sobbed with a heart-wrenching sound, not so much from the physical pain, but from the humiliation of being assaulted by the man she had placed her trust in. Mark was breathing hard, as if the violence had left him immediately empty. Instead of helping her, he picked up his phone, which was vibrating again with Jessica's name on the screen. He answered in a hurried voice without even looking at Sarah. "Yeah, I'm on my way. Wait for me." He walked toward the door with firm steps, as if everything that had just happened was of no importance. Sarah watched him from the floor, incredulous at such coldness. She heard the door slam shut and the echo of his footsteps fading down the stairs. The silence that followed was more cruel than the previous shouts. Sarah remained on the floor for a few seconds, trembling, caressing her red cheek and hugging her belly. Fear mixed with an unexpected determination. She understood that she couldn't continue this fight alone, that the time had come to seek refuge with those who truly loved her. She got up slowly, wiped away her tears with her sleeve and grabbed a light jacket. With trembling hands, she put her keys in her pocket and left the apartment. The city was celebrating, oblivious to her pain. The festival lights reflected on the balconies. People were laughing and dancing in the streets. Vendors were offering sweets and wine. Sarah walked through the crowd with her head down, feeling that each step was a monumental effort. Some people looked at her, not understanding why a pregnant woman was crying silently in the middle of the celebration. She didn't stop. Her feet guided her instinctively toward her family's house, where she had always found comfort. When she reached the door, her hands were trembling so much that she could barely manage to ring the doorbell. The gate opened and Mr. Williams, her father, appeared, dressed in casual clothes with a serene expression. When he saw her, his serenity turned into a mix of surprise and anguish. Sarah could barely utter a word before collapsing into his arms. "Dad!" Mr. Williams' face hardened when he noticed the red mark on his daughter's cheek. He held her firmly and led her inside. Mrs. Williams came running when she heard the crying and wrapped Sarah in a tender embrace. Between sobs, Sarah explained what had happened. She talked about the messages, the smiles that were no longer for her, and the slap that felt like a definitive break. Each word fell like lead on her parents' hearts. Eleanor cried with her, stroking her hair, reminding her that she was not alone. Richard, for his part, remained silent, his eyes fixed on a distant point, like a man preparing an irrevocable decision. When Sarah finished her story, her father took a deep breath and spoke in a low, grave voice. "This will not go unanswered, my daughter." The weight of that promise settled in the room. Sarah, still trembling, felt a spark of relief for the first time in weeks. Not because the wound had healed, but because she knew she wouldn't have to face the monster her husband had become alone. Richard helped her sit down. He asked her to rest and assured her that he would take care of everything. Eleanor brought her a glass of water and sat beside her, not letting go of her hand. In the silence of the house, they could hear the distant echoes of the festival. For Sarah, that music no longer meant celebration, but a reminder that even in the midst of the most cheerful noise, an unbearable pain can be hidden. She looked at her parents and understood that they were her true strength. In that instant, she decided that what had started as a marriage full of promises could no longer continue. Her priority would be to protect her child and rebuild her life with the support of her family. The mark on her cheek still burned, but the memory of Mark's coldness burned even more. She knew it wouldn't be easy to forget, but she also understood that every wound could become a new impulse. She closed her eyes and rested her head on her mother's shoulder, listening to her father's steady breathing. The world continued outside with its lights and songs, but inside that house, a flame of resistance had been lit. Sarah knew that the slap was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a path toward the truth and the strength that had always been in her family. Mr. Williams, in a firm voice, repeated once more what Sarah would hold in her memory like a vow. "This will not go unanswered, my daughter." The chiming of the Charleston church bells announced the afternoon service, but a dense silence reigned in Mr. Williams' office. The businessman had spent the morning reviewing documents with a grim expression. Across from him, Sarah remained seated, her cheeks still red from the slap she had received days earlier. Eleanor was with her, holding her hand tenderly. Richard, who rarely showed his anger, had eyes ablaze with an iron determination. He had listened to his daughter's story in every detail, and now he knew he had to act. The father didn't ask any more questions. He didn't want to pick at Sarah's wounds. What he did was call his trusted assistant, a discreet man who had worked for him for years. He handed him a set of folders and gave him clear instructions. I need you to review all of Mark Jensen's financial movements. I want to know what he spends on, who he meets with, who he benefits. Look for anything that isn't clean. The assistant nodded without asking questions. He understood the seriousness of the task. Sarah watched him with a mix of relief and fear. She had never seen her father so decisive. As the assistant left with the documents, Richard approached his daughter. He caressed her cheek with the same tenderness he had when she was a child and said in a firm voice, "No one raises a hand against a Williams and gets away with it." Sarah began to cry, not out of sadness, but from the certainty that finally someone was on her side. Eleanor was also moved, grateful to see how Richard was putting his strength in the service of his family. The promise he had made the night before was beginning to take shape. Hours later, the assistant returned with information that confirmed their suspicions. There were suspicious transfers, payments made in the name of Jessica Adams, a young bartender with no financial history who, all of a sudden, was receiving money from accounts linked to Mark. The discovery hit the room like a bolt of lightning. Richard frowned and picked up the papers with a calm fury. Sarah, listening to him, felt anger mixed with sadness. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. Now it was tangible, with numbers and names. Richard didn't raise his voice. It wasn't his style. But he spoke with the firmness of a man who knows the time has come to act. "Sarah, you are not alone. This is not your fault. What this man did, he is going to pay for." Sarah looked at him with tear-filled eyes, grateful for the protection she so desperately needed. Inside, she felt scared, because she knew Mark was proud and could react violently. But she also felt a new sense of peace. She had her family as a shield. The afternoon went on. Charleston continued its routine with tourists in the streets and young people at the cafes. But in the Williams house, a decision was being made. Richard was silently outlining a plan. It wasn't enough to demand justice in private. He had to expose the truth about Mark in public, in front of everyone, where the betrayal couldn't be hidden. He knew that in a few days there would be a business event in the historic square, and that would be the perfect occasion to open everyone's eyes. Eleanor took Sarah to rest. The young mother lay down in the bed in her old room and closed her eyes. She could hear her father's voice giving orders from afar, the assistant's whisper confirming tasks, the echo of justice approaching. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to breathe with some peace. The fear was still there, but she was not alone. The climax came when Richard, with the documents in hand, looked at his daughter again. The mark on her face was a reminder of the pain, but also the spark that ignited the fight. "This will not remain in the shadows," he said in a grave voice. "We will face him where everyone can see." Sarah nodded, understanding that the path wouldn't be easy, but that there was finally hope. That night, as the city lights slowly went out, Mr. Williams's vow echoed in every corner of the house. Sarah embraced the idea that, despite the wounds, her family was stronger than the lies and the violence. The future was yet to be decided, and although the battle hadn't yet begun, it was already clear that the outcome would change their lives forever. While Sarah rested at her parents' house with her face still marked by sadness, in another part of Charleston, Mark Jensen felt invincible. He had arranged a dinner with Jessica Adams, convinced that this woman represented the freedom he had so often spoken of. The restaurant he chose was near the Ashley River, a discreet place where he could show her off without fear of interruption. When Jessica arrived, she greeted him with a smile that seemed made just for him. Mark looked at her with pride, as if he was showing the world his new conquest. During dinner, he spoke enthusiastically about his business, how he would soon take full control of the Williams company, and how little he cared about the opinions of others. Jessica listened, leaning in, hanging on his every word. Mark reveled in that attention, an abysmal contrast to the silence he found at home. For him, her admiration was pure fuel. He didn't care about the betrayal or the harm he had caused Sarah. He only thought about the present moment, the glass of wine in front of him, and the sparkle in the eyes of the woman who was flattering him. Jessica, with great skill, steered the conversation to what truly interested her. She asked in a soft voice what would happen to Sarah's inheritance, the shares she had in her family's company. Mark, emboldened by the wine and his desire to impress, answered without much thought. "It will all end up being mine," he said with arrogance. She feigned surprise, but inside she was celebrating her progress. She encouraged him to keep talking, showering him with compliments, and with each phrase she entangled him further in her game. At the same time, Sarah silently remembered her father's words. "You are not alone." Her hands rested on her belly, and that certainty gave her strength. She didn't know what Mark was doing at that moment, but she sensed that his distance had a face and a name. In her heart, the betrayal still ached, but a new conviction was also being born. She would not allow the lie to destroy her. Mark's night with Jessica continued with more glasses of wine and reckless confessions. He spoke of how weak Sarah was, how she had no character to run anything, and how soon he would get rid of her shadow. Jessica smiled coldly. "So you don't need Sarah in your way," she said in a low voice, a whisper laced with poison. Mark looked at her, hesitated for just a second, but then laughed carelessly. "Of course not," he replied. In that laugh was hidden the blindness of a man who believed he controlled everything. He didn't realize that his words were daggers that would soon turn against him. Meanwhile, Jessica gently squeezed his hand across the table, sealing a silent pact. Both of their ambitions had merged, and each step brought them closer to disaster. The climax of the night came when Jessica, after a toast, looked Mark in the eye and said a phrase that would be etched in his memory. "Then all you have to do is get rid of your past. Sarah and her family are nothing more than an obstacle." Mark, his mind clouded by alcohol and ego, didn't fully understand the reach of those words. He took them as a simple comment, but the shadow of betrayal already loomed over him. The dinner ended with laughter and promises of future meetings. Mark left the restaurant with the feeling that he had conquered something important, while Charleston remained vibrant under the nightlights. In his pocket, he kept Jessica's number, and in his mind, the mirage of a future he believed was secure. However, far away, in the Williams house, Mr. Williams was reviewing the documents that incriminated him and planning how to expose him in front of everyone. Sarah slept with dry tears on her face, unaware that the final confrontation was approaching. The city, oblivious to the storm, continued to celebrate, but the pieces were already in place for the truth to come to light. Mark drank the last sip of wine without suspecting that his downfall had already begun. The historic square was filled with lights and voices. It was the night of the most anticipated business event of the year, and all the partners, investors, and neighbors attended with enthusiasm. In the center of the stage, Mark Jensen was preparing to give his speech, convinced that this was his definitive opportunity to show himself as the new face of power. He was dressed elegantly and walked with confidence, although inside He was dragging the inflated pride from his nights with Jessica. There was no room for doubt in his mind. He believed the future belonged to him. In the audience, Sarah Williams watched with a serene face, accompanied by her parents. She had decided to be there, not to support Mark, but to witness the moment the truth would be revealed. Mr. Williams stood firm, with a folder of documents under his arm. Mrs. Williams, standing next to her daughter, caressed her hand in a silent gesture of support. They were all waiting for the precise moment. Mark took the stage and grabbed the microphone with a solemn air. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today we celebrate a new beginning for our company." He spoke of contracts, projects, and future investments. Every word was full of arrogance, as if he no longer needed anyone. He smiled with confidence, convinced that the crowd was applauding him sincerely. Jessica, sitting among the guests, looked at him with pride, knowing that her influence had brought him here. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach listening to her husband's voice. She remembered every slight, every lie, and the slap that still ached in her memory. But she didn't collapse. She knew the moment was coming when the truth would surface. She looked at her father, and he gave her a firm look in return, like a man announcing that the final blow was imminent. When Mark finished his speech and the people applauded, Mr. Williams took a step forward. He walked toward the stage with sure steps. Mark watched him, surprised, trying to smile. But that smile faded when he saw the seriousness in his father-in-law's eyes. Mr. Williams asked to speak, and the audience, intrigued, fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a grave voice, "what you have just heard is nothing but a facade. Here, I have proof that Mark Jensen not only deceived people in business, diverting money to improper accounts, but that he also betrayed the most sacred trust." He pointed to Sarah, whose cheek still seemed marked by the memory of the violence. Mark went pale and tried to intervene, but Richard raised his hand to silence him. The murmuring of the crowd immediately grew. Some guests exchanged looks of indignation, others took out their phones to record what was happening. Richard opened the folder and showed the transfers, the signatures, the records, documents that proved Mark had used company funds to benefit Jessica Adams, his mistress. The cameras captured the stunned face of Jessica, who had not expected to be named publicly. The climax came when Richard said the words that made the square rumble. "Not only is this a man who steals, he is a man who raised his hand against my pregnant daughter." The silence was broken by gasps of horror. Sarah, hearing the truth from her father's voice, felt a mix of pain and liberation. For the first time, she was not the one bearing the pain alone. Now everyone knew who Mark Jensen really was. The crowd began to murmur with indignation. Some looked away from Mark, others pointed at him with contempt. Jessica, embarrassed, took a step back, trying to slip away. Mark, his face contorted, tried to regain control. "This is a lie," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the sea of disapproval. No one believed him anymore. The press cameras captured every instant. Mark's prestige was crumbling in front of the entire city. Mr. Williams closed the folder with calm and looked at the crowd. "Charleston deserves honest leaders, not frauds who destroy families." The crowd responded with applause. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, held her gaze on her husband for the last time. There was no more fear inside her, only the certainty that justice had been served. The scene ended with Mark standing, paralyzed, while the crowd surrounded him with whispers of contempt. Jessica disappeared among the people, and Mr. Williams turned to his daughter to lead her back home. The historic square, a witness to so many celebrations, had become on that night the stage for a truth impossible to hide. Mark Jensen's fall was now an irreversible fact. The historic square still held the echo of the scandal from the night before. Mark Jensen was left alone in the shadows. his reputation destroyed and the subject of everyone's contempt. Sarah Williams, for her part, woke up in her parents' house with a new sense of peace. She had slept little, but for the first time in a long time, she got up without feeling afraid. Her cheek no longer burned as it had before, and in her heart there was a sigh of relief. She knew the battle had not been easy, but she could finally breathe again beside those who would never abandon her. That afternoon, the family gathered in the patio of the house, an intimate space where the quiet whispers of conversation brought comfort. Mr. Williams presided over the table with the serenity of a man who had kept a promise. Mrs. Williams served the dishes with sweetness, attentive to her daughter's every need. Sarah, sitting between them, caressed her belly with tenderness, thinking about the child who was about to be born. She didn't need solemn speeches to understand that this was the true victory. She was surrounded by love, the only foundation capable of sustaining her. During the meal, Sarah spoke frankly. She said that the road ahead would not be easy, that the wound still felt open, but that she was ready to start over. Eleanor responded with simple words, reminding her that no wound is permanent when it is healed with kindness. Richard added in a firm voice that the most important thing was to always remember the value of family. Life can take everything away from you except the bond that unites those who truly support each other. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of the city, Mark wandered aimlessly. He had lost the company, the respect, and the trust of everyone. Jessica had abandoned him without a second thought. His business associates were no longer answering his calls. He walked with a broken face, replaying the images from the historic square in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the murmurs, the applause for Mr. Williams, and the contempt directed at him. In a bitter whisper, he acknowledged the truth. He had lost everything for a single raised hand. Sarah, in contrast, found strength in what was essential. Her mother told her anecdotes from when she was a child, stories of resilience that served as an example. Her father, more reserved, watched her with silent pride. He knew his daughter had suffered, but also that she had shown admirable strength. That family lunch wasn't just an everyday gesture. It was a confirmation that Sarah was not broken. She was stronger, sustained by true love. As night fell, Sarah went out onto the balcony and breathed in the fresh Charleston air. The city was still alive with its bustle and its lights, but inside her, everything had calmed down. She closed her eyes and thought about the future. She imagined her child growing up with games and hugs, surrounded by the security she had reclaimed. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. There were scars that would take a long time to heal, but at that moment, she understood that pain didn't define her destiny. Hope did. The intimate climax of that day came when Mr. Williams approached her and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. He looked her in the eyes and said calmly, "Daughter, always remember that family is the only thing that never fails you." Sarah hugged him tightly, grateful, and in that gesture, she felt renewed. She was not just a daughter receiving comfort. She was a mother learning how to pass on strength. Mark, for his part, found himself sitting on a lonely bench, staring into the darkness without a destination. He whispered in a broken voice what he already knew, but didn't want to admit. "I lost everything for a single raised hand." That phrase became his sentence, the bitter conclusion to a life that had despised what was essential. No one was listening to him, because no one was willing to be with him anymore. Sarah's last glance that night was toward the sky. With a serene smile, she caressed her belly and promised herself that her child would grow up surrounded by dignity and love. She had learned that true strength is not found in business or appearances. It is found in family, in the arms that never let go, in the voice of a father who promises justice, and in the tenderness of a mother who always cares. And with that certainty, Sarah prepared for the future with her head held high and her heart at peace. This story teaches a profound lesson. True love is not measured in empty words or broken promises, but in daily gestures of support and loyalty. Human error, while it can be devastating, always opens a door to reflection and a chance for atonement. The family, with its silent and firm refuge, becomes that beacon that guides us even when the darkness seems total. The warmth of a home can give light and comfort again at the least expected moment. In the end, what builds a life are not ephemeral triumphs, but the ability to ask for forgiveness, to get back up, and to trust again in those who never abandon you. Perhaps you, who are listening or reading these words, remember moments in your own life when family was a refuge, or when forgiveness transformed a wound into strength. Perhaps this story invites you to once again value those close hands that have always been there, even on the quietest days. Take a moment to reflect on the gift of company and patience, on that love that doesn't seek recognition but holds everything else up. If this story resonated with you, share it, because sometimes all it takes is a friendly voice to remind others that it's never too late to mend the past and embrace the quiet power of family. If Sarah's story inspired you, if her fight for dignity and justice gave you hope, hit the like button right now. And tell me in the comments, what was the most impactful moment for you? The slap, the speech in the square, or the new life she built with her family? Don't miss more stories like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos.